moved to New York City, and I lived with Sean Puffy Combs for a year.
That's the crazy thing.
Let's talk about the filth that's starting to come out in the early days of the Diddy trial. This, of course, is P. Diddy. Surprise, surprise, he's a creep. Surprise, surprise, he's done horrible things.
Usher walked into the courtroom that day carrying more than just the weight of his testimony. He was carrying decades of secrets, carefully buried under layers of fame, success, and loyalty to a man who had once been his mentor. The flashes of cameras outside, the murmurs of reporters speculating on what he might say, it was all a blur. This wasn't just another celebrity trial. This was Sean Diddy Combs, the kingmaker of the music world, a man so deeply entrenched in the entertainment industry's fabric that his influence seemed untouchable. But now, that empire was being chipped away, piece by piece, and Usher was about to deliver a hammer blow.
Look at Diddy, for instance. Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at him. Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at, he has videos. He has videos of the parties. Now, what I've heard, which I don't know how much of it is in mainstream media, I don't really follow the story that much, but what I've heard from friends that are attorneys, friends of mine that have represented me before, agents and so on, is there's a bidding war going on.
So Usher's connection to Diddy wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. At just 14 years old, he was sent to live with the music mogul in New York. The decision wasn't Usher's. It was orchestrated by LaFace Records executives who believed that Diddy, then the epitome of success, swagger, and creative genius, could mold the young artist into a star. On the surface, it made sense. Diddy had an undeniable knack for turning raw talent into chart-topping icons. But what LaFace Records pitched as a golden opportunity quickly became something far darker. A chapter in Usher's life that he'd spent years trying to reconcile. Back then, Diddy's home wasn't just a residence. It was a revolving door for celebrities, aspiring artists, and anyone lucky enough to be orbiting his gravitational pull. For a teenager like Usher, it was overwhelming. The house was alive at all hours, a pulsating hive of activity where the music was always loud, the energy intoxicating, and the rules seemed non-existent. There was no structure, no mentorship in the way he'd envisioned. Instead, it was chaos wrapped in luxury. It was a world where boundaries blurred and excess was the norm. To a teenager navigating the murky waters of fame, it felt like being thrown into the deep end without a life jacket.
Right?
No, not really. I mean, but hey, it was curious. I got a chance to see some things.
Yeah, but you were 13. What were you seeing?
I went there to see the lifestyle.
What Usher saw during that time left an indelible mark on him. There were gatherings that stretched into the early hours where the guest list ranged from industry giants to complete strangers. There were moments of reckless abandon that, even as a young teen, felt like they teetered on the edge of something dangerous. Usher's job was to observe, to soak it all in, but what he absorbed was far beyond his years. It wasn't just the parties or the constant parade of people. It was the culture of indulgence, power, and impunity that lingered in every corner of that house. For years, he had brushed it off as part of the lifestyle, something he wasn't meant to fully understand. But now, sitting in that courtroom, it all came rushing back with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. When Usher finally began recounting those years during his testimony, the courtroom fell silent. He spoke about how, as a teenager, he had been tasked with navigating a world he didn't fully understand, a world where he was supposed to learn the ropes, but instead found himself witnessing events that left him confused and unsettled. He described moments that felt surreal, almost cinematic in their extravagance and absurdity. But these weren't scenes from a music video, this was real life, and it was far from glamorous. Usher shared how he would wake up some mornings unsure of what he had seen the night before, unsure of what was normal and what wasn't.
I didn't say that.
Okay.
I didn't say that. What I did say is that there were very curious things taking place, and I didn't necessarily understand it.
The most chilling part of Usher's testimony wasn't just the anecdotes, it was the realization that he wasn't treated as a young artist in training, but as just another piece of this chaotic puzzle. The people around him, adults who should have been guiding and protecting him, seemed more interested in their proximity to Diddy's orbit than in maintaining any sense of responsibility toward a 14-year-old boy. Usher spoke about how he felt out of place, as though he were a spectator in a show he didn't audition for, and despite his natural talent and drive, it became clear that Diddy's mentorship wasn't about nurturing his artistry, it was about throwing him into the fire to see if he could survive. What added even more weight to Usher's words were the patterns they revealed. Patterns that aligned with allegations from others who had been part of Diddy's inner circle. The stories of blurred boundaries, of power wielded unchecked, weren't unique to Usher. They painted a picture of a culture where control and manipulation seemed to be part of the playbook. For years, former associates and collaborators had hinted at the darker side of Diddy's empire, but few had dared to speak out in detail. Usher's testimony changed that. It gave those whispers a voice, a face, and a story that was impossible to ignore.
What'd they do to him? Because there's a lot of speculation out there, but nobody, I mean, I've heard things, but what did they really do to him?
Usher's revelations also cast a spotlight on the decisions made by those who had sent him into that environment in the first place. LaFace Records executives had framed the move as a strategic career step, a chance for Usher to learn from one of the best in the business. But in hindsight, it raised troubling questions. Did they know what kind of environment they were sending him into? Did they turn a blind eye to the rumors, or were they so blinded by Diddy's success that they were willing to overlook the warning signs? These were questions that lingered in the courtroom air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. The courtroom drama reached a fever pitch when Usher was asked to clarify what he meant by wild and curious things he had witnessed. He hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing his words before describing an atmosphere of unpredictability that left him constantly on edge. It wasn't just the parties or the late nights. It was the unspoken rules, the undercurrent of something unnameable that made it clear this wasn't just about music or mentorship. Usher didn't spell everything out in explicit detail, but the implications were enough to send chills down the spines of everyone in the room.
I hate to say that. I hate to say that because I really like Justin Bieber. I feel bad for Justin Bieber. And this is when that happened.
As the defense attempted to discredit Usher, they brought up his past interviews where he had spoken positively about Diddy. They highlighted his glowing remarks about the mentorship, his gratitude for the opportunities he had been given, and even his acknowledgement that the experience had shaped him as an artist. But Usher didn't flinch. He acknowledged that, yes, he had once seen Diddy as a mentor, even a big brother, but time and perspective had revealed a darker reality, one he couldn't ignore any longer. And then came the moment that would be replayed on news channels and dissected in headlines for weeks. When asked directly if he believed Diddy's actions had crossed a line, Usher didn't hesitate. Yes, he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. It wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration, a breaking point in a relationship that had defined so much of his career. For years, he had carried the weight of those memories alone, but now, in front of the world, he was laying them bare.
Sure, yeah, Justin Bieber has been getting this out in different ways. You know, you could see it in his music and just what he's been trying to say.
As Usher stepped down from the stand, the courtroom remained silent, the gravity of his testimony sinking in. This wasn't just about one man's experiences, it was a window into a culture that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for far too long. And as the doors of the courtroom swung open, letting in the light of day, it became clear that Usher's words were just the beginning. The floodgates had been opened, and the questions swirling around Diddy's empire were only growing louder. And just when it seemed like Usher's testimony had peeled back every layer of this sordid story, a deeper, darker web began to unravel. Because let's be honest, this wasn't just about Usher. He may have been the first to break his silence in such a public way, but his words opened the floodgates for a cascade of unsettling revelations. What became clear, almost immediately, was that Usher's experience was not an outlier. Far from it. His story wasn't just a glimpse into Sean Diddy Combs' world, it was a template, a blueprint for a pattern of control and excess that would implicate countless others.
We'll take Justin Bieber. A grown man take Justin Bieber when he was young to a vacation, a romantic vacation, showing pictures on it.
The whispers started even before the trial, but now they were deafening. Justin Bieber's name came up almost immediately, dragging with it a trail of eerie similarities. Bieber was only a teenager when Diddy brought him into his orbit, much like Usher years before. What was initially presented to the world as a mentorship, a kind of passing of the torch, was beginning to look more and more like a sinister rerun. Bieber, at the time, had been paraded in front of cameras alongside Diddy, the two of them laughing, driving luxury cars, and sharing cryptic comments about their time together. But behind the flashy public facade, the rumors hinted at something far more unsettling. The most chilling detail? A resurfaced video from that period showed Diddy speaking directly to the camera, gleefully describing how he had custody of Bieber for 48 hours. His tone was playful, but the subtext was impossible to ignore. Bieber, a wide-eyed teenager at the time, looked more like a pawn than a protege. Diddy's comments about how they were spending their time, comments that he refused to elaborate on, now carried a weight that was hard to shake. And then there was Bieber's silence. For years, he had stayed quiet, even as speculation mounted. But silence, as they say, can be deafening. And in this case, it only added to the growing sense of unease.
They took Justin Bieber, and just them, that's not only is it a bad look, it's sad.
What made Bieber's silence even more jarring was the timeline of his meteoric rise. At just 15 years old, he had become a global sensation, and while much of the credit was given to his musical talent and his mentor Usher, Diddy's shadow loomed large in the background. There were photos, videos, and cryptic social media posts that hinted at a relationship far more complicated than the public knew. In one particularly eyebrow-raising clip from an interview, Diddy referred to Bieber as "my little man" and joked about how he was showing him the ropes. But what ropes exactly? The vagueness of Diddy's language made it hard to pin down, but in light of recent revelations, those words carried a much darker undertone. It wasn't just mentorship. It felt like grooming, a calculated process of bringing someone into a world they weren't prepared for. Then there were the vacations. Multiple sources have alleged that Diddy would take Bieber on trips, ones that were reportedly framed as bonding experiences or opportunities to network. But these trips were shrouded in secrecy, with few details ever made public. One former associate even claimed that Diddy had a habit of surrounding himself with young, impressionable stars, taking them on lavish getaways where the rules of the outside world didn't seem to apply. For Bieber, it seemed like a dream come true at the time, but looking back, those trips now raise more questions than answers. Who else was there? What really happened behind closed doors? And why has Bieber never spoken about it since?
To not be involved with a famous singer, to not come out, here's the price. And that they're just selling to the individuals that are in those, this is what I heard, they're selling those videos. So if you're Tommy X, and Tommy X is a big, big movie star, and he was at some of the Diddy parties. He was in one of those bedrooms with 3 other men, and he's happily married to a woman, and blah. Tommy doesn't want that video to come out.
Even more unsettling was the way Diddy seemed to dangle opportunities like carrots on a stick, creating a dynamic where loyalty wasn't just expected, it was demanded. Bieber's early career was heavily influenced by the relationships he formed in those crucial years, and Diddy was at the center of many of them. But former insiders have suggested that these opportunities came with strings attached. If you wanted Diddy's backing, you had to play by his rules, and for a teenager like Bieber, the stakes couldn't have been higher. He wasn't just trying to make it in the industry, he was trying to survive it. The pressure to conform, to stay quiet, and to go along with whatever was happening must have been immense. And while Bieber eventually became one of the biggest stars on the planet, those early years now seem tainted by an undercurrent of exploitation that he's never publicly addressed.
Same thing for Jeffrey Epstein. Now, the interesting thing about the Epstein and the theory about Epstein is we know he filmed people for sure on that island. He has a lot of movies, a lot of films of people that are very, very powerful political figures and entertainers, business people. So do you really believe that Jeffrey Epstein himself? And
Of course not.
Of course not.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just Bieber. As more names began to surface, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Former associates, aspiring artists, and even household names started sharing stories that echoed the same themes. Power dynamics, blurred boundaries, and an unspoken understanding that Diddy's influence came with strings attached. Some of these strings, it seemed, were tied to the kind of leverage that could destroy careers. The whispers of blackmail, rumors that had swirled around Diddy for years, were now being whispered louder, and with a new sense of urgency. The alleged methods were as calculated as they were chilling. According to multiple accounts, Diddy had a habit of keeping receipts, videos, photos, and other material that could be used as leverage if anyone dared to cross him. These weren't just idle threats either. Several sources claimed that Diddy had used this material to control not just his business rivals, but also those closest to him. It was a kind of insurance policy, a way to ensure loyalty in a world where loyalty could mean the difference between fame and obscurity. And for those who had the courage to walk away, the consequences were reportedly swift and brutal, both professionally and personally.
Did you ever spend time with the guy? Did you ever meet Diddy?
I've met him before, yeah.
How was he?
Very nice guy, very smart, super business. You know, I mean, he's very successful.
One story that emerged involved a former artist who had been part of Diddy's inner circle. This individual, whose career had never quite taken off, claimed that Diddy had used compromising material against them to force compliance. The details were murky, but the implications were clear. Stepping out of line came with a price. And while this story was shocking, it was far from unique. Over and over, accounts emerged of people who felt trapped, unable to speak out for fear of what Diddy might release into the world. And then there was the culture of silence, the unspoken code that seemed to permeate every corner of Diddy's empire. It wasn't just the fear of retaliation that kept people quiet. It was the systemic nature of the industry itself. In a world where connections were everything, burning a bridge with someone as powerful as Diddy could mean career destruction. For many, it was easier to stay silent, to play along, than to risk everything by speaking out. And so, the cycle continued, unchecked and unchallenged, for years.
I'll tell you, I don't know how much, I don't like to say things that I know unless I see it. That there's a little difference, but was it discussed? Was there descriptions from people I know that were at those? Yes, but here's another thing. So how many of these big entertainment parties and over the years and everything with as successful as you are, have you been around? Does anyone ever come up to you at a certain hour and say, okay, it's time to go? At those parties they did.
The most damning aspect of all this wasn't just the stories themselves. It was the sheer volume of them. Each new account added another layer to the picture, and what emerged was a portrait of a man who had built his empire not just on talent and ambition, but on power and control. And the people who had been caught in his orbit were left to pick up the pieces, their lives forever altered by their proximity to one of the industry's most influential figures. But the most unsettling question remained: how many more stories were out there waiting to be told? Because if Usher's testimony had taught us anything, it was that Diddy's reach extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. And with each new revelation, it became harder to ignore the mounting evidence that this wasn't just a series of isolated incidents. This was a system, a culture, built around one man's unchecked power.
People I don't think realized was he had cameras all over the place, unbeknownst to them. And now he has all that footage, supposedly. This is what I'm told. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens if, you're a huge, iconic, TV star or movie star, and you're in some very, very...
So, what do you think? Is this just the tip of the iceberg? Or is there even more to this story waiting to come out? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And trust us, you're going to want to stay tuned for what's coming next. This one is far from over. See you in the next one.